Welcome to Fredla's Learning Community for Family Leaders. My name is Jane Walker. I am the Executive Director of Fredla, and as you've been doing all along, we invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and let us know who you are and where you're from. And if this is your first Learning Community call, we especially welcome you. Throughout the call, we welcome you to make comments and ask questions in the chat box, as everyone but the presenters will be on mute. If you're driving in your car, please be safe. If you're not at your computer, we want you to know that handouts will be available along with the recording of the webinar, and at the end of the presentation we'll let you know how to access those. For those of you who are at your computers, you can see the handouts under the little box files, and those can be downloaded at any time. This learning community is hosted by Fredla, the family-run Executive Director Leadership Association. We are a partner in the National Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operated by and coordinated through the University of Maryland under a contract with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse, and Mental Health Services Administration. I wanted to let you know that at the end of the webinar, before you close out the screen, the University of Maryland is doing a short survey of usability of webinars. So I'll remind you of that later, but just wanted you to have a heads up at the beginning. So our learning community for family leaders is held about 8 times a year, and if you've joined us on previous calls, you know the rich information that is shared by experts who have presented on our calls, but also the information that has been shared in the chat box among the participants on the call. So again, we encourage you, if you have other thoughts in addition to questions, please share that with other people, resources, or your experiences. Our last call was in November, and so this is our first call of 2018. November's call was on the topic of supporting grandparents, and if you were able to join us, you know it was a tearjerker. And how many times can you say you have been on a webinar that made you cry? Well, that one did. But today's webinar won't make you cry, and hopefully it won't make you cringe either. Our topic is quite different from our usual topics, and the reason for that is that this webinar was planned in anticipation of SAMHSA releasing a funding opportunity announcement, or FOA. I know we used to call it an RFA, now it's an FOA, for Statewide Family Network grants on or about February 13th of this year. Those of you who have applied for these grants before know that Appendix 4 of the application has a section on confidentiality and SAMHSA participant protection and human subject guidelines. Family-run organizations often struggle with this section of the application, and often as grants are reviewed, applicants are contacted and asked to revise or rewrite this section. For this reason, Fredla decided to host this learning community call on this specific topic so applicants could be prepared when the FOA comes out. Please know that on this call, we cannot respond to any specific questions about the FOA as it has not yet come out yet. We are delighted to have Liz Sweet, Health Advisor and Project Officer for the Child and Adolescent and Family Branch at SAMHSA, as well as Peggy Nickel, our very own Fredla Project Coordinator, who was formerly the Executive Director of Uplift, the Statewide Family Network in Wyoming. And so Peggy has plenty of experience in writing Statewide Family Network proposals, and she always got excellent feedback on this particular section of the application. But before we get started, let's do a couple of polling questions. So, Tiara, Can you put up our first question? Okay. So has your family-run organization ever facilitated focus groups or surveys? Options are yes or no vote. So just click on the one that we'll wait for just a second till everybody has a chance to answer. Okay. So we only have a few answers here, but of those, 85% have said that they have had focus groups or surveys. So let's move on to question 2. Does your family-run organization evaluate the services you provide? Yes or no? Okay. All right. About the same percentage. Still not a huge poll, but let's move to question 3. Does your organization report to funders on information you collect from families? Yes or no? Okay, this poll is interesting. Some do and some don't, but more do than don't. Okay, thanks, Tara. So if you answered yes to any of those questions, or if in your proposal you plan to do any of those things, or lots of other things as well, then your organization needs to have written guidelines on participant protection and confidentiality, which is the topic of our call today. However, you should have these guidelines and procedures in place regardless of whether you are SAMHSA grantee or not. These guidelines are a necessary part of practice for every family-run organization. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Liz Sweet, the Statewide Family Network project officer, and certainly a friend to all of us, to kind of get us started today. Liz?
Good afternoon and greetings from the Center for Mental Health Services, and specifically from our branch, the Child, Adolescent, and Family branch. And as Jane was saying earlier, in the forecast that went out from SAMHSA late last year, it was stated that SAMHSA is hoping to have an FOA for a new round of funding for the Statewide Family Network program. There are a lot of things that are contingent on that decision, and as Jane said, the forecast said that we were hoping that we would have that announcement available and posted sometime in the middle of February. What has happened in the meantime is that when the government decided after the shutdown that they were going to do another continuing resolution, if you were listening, they said they were going to fund the federal government for 3 more weeks. And if you look on the calendar, that's just about the time that SAMHSA in the forecast said that the new FOA would be posted. So here are a couple of things. One is, as long as we are on a continuing resolution, we only have the same amount of money as we were provided and authorized to spend last year. And that being the case, there are several things that you probably are interested in. There are 6 statewide family networks that are coming to the end of their funding this summer. And so given that, if we are on a continuing resolution, that means that we would only have the same amount of money as we had last year, and only 6 awards could be made in the upcoming year. If in fact, when the President's budget comes out on the 8th, I think it is, of, the 5th of February, if Congress can all come to an agreement, which they've not been able to do to this point, and they would pass a budget, then we may have additional funds, or we may have fewer funds for awards to be made. So we aren't even guessing at this point how many awards will be made, because we have no idea what our funding is going to look like. Also, if this continuing resolution in 3 weeks ends and Congress decides that the issues they cannot agree on and they close the government, then no work by our agency or other agencies can continue. And so that would mean you would not expect to see a posting of the potential FOA. So there are a lot of things that I would suggest and encourage you to do. Number one is keep your eyes and ears on the news so that you know what's happening with the federal government. And the second is to continue to watch the SAMHSA website. As any new funding announcements will be posted on the website. So watch SAMHSA's website, watch the news, and you will get an idea of whether or not there will be a new award that will be posted and when it will be posted, because at this point we don't have an answer to any of those questions. I am very excited that FREDLA has arranged to have this webinar in particular, because as Jane was sharing earlier, this is one piece of the application process that many, many people find difficult to complete in a way that the application can move forward in the review process. So hopefully we will get a lot of people's questions answered, and if at the close of this and you are submitting an application, if we have the opportunity to post an FOA, at that point, then any questions about participant protection issues would be directed directly to me. So I am excited to be a part of this this meeting today, in this presentation, and I look forward to hearing from many of you in the future. And at that, I will send it back to Jane.
Thanks, Liz. You know, it's unsettling times for all of us, and you know, all we can do is just keep moving forward as we do with our families. Family organizations and family leaders, incredibly resilient people, and it must be difficult for you, Liz, especially having to share that news with people and organizations that you have dedicated your life to. That being said, we will move forward however we have to, right? Keep our ears and eyes open for news from SAMHSA, and of course news about the compromise at the federal government level. So with that, it's my pleasure to also turn it over to Peggy Nickel from FREDLA, who I have the pleasure of working with, who's going to really talk more in depth about what is included in Appendix 4 and how family organizations need to respond to that, as well as giving you all kinds of resources to help you. All right, Peggy, over to you.
Thanks, Jane and Liz. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'll be the first to admit that for an afternoon session, this gets pretty deep in the weeds, and yet it's something that we all really need to understand, and it really is fairly simple and logical. If you just follow through, I think you'll find it makes sense, and it's something that you easily can put in place for your organization. Whether you ever have the opportunity to apply for Statewide Family Network grant funding or not, these are great guidelines to have in place. But why in the world is patient protection and confidentiality important for family-run organizations? You know, when family-run organizations began in the late 1980s, there was not a big focus on patient protections. For these organizations, their patients consisted of families seeking support, advocacy, and education from other family members and professionals with a shared experience in raising a child with an emotional or behavioral health challenge. In most cases, it was a very casual relationship between individuals with a shared experience. But you know that has changed, and now family-run organizations that receive government funding and may also be Medicaid providers must adhere to professional standards expected of any other behavioral health provider. The first area that the appendix in the FOA for Statewide Family Networks addresses and that we want to discuss is protecting clients from potential risk. You know, we don't think of programs or services provided by family-run organizations in the context of research. However, when applying for a SAMHSA grant, activities such as focus groups, surveys of families, parent peer support, and even training programs can be considered a type of research involving human subjects. For this reason, grantees are required to identify any foreseeable physical, medical, psychological, social, and legal risks as a result of the project or any data collection. Let's just use the example of a training program that might be offered by a family-run organization and think about some of the potential risks that could be associated with participating in a group. If we think about foreseeable risks, we might identify several possibilities, such as a topic that is part of the curriculum or something that's raised by another participant that could trigger a memory, maybe even a panic attack or a post-traumatic stress response from another participant in the group. Or a family may disclose very personal information about themselves to others in the group that they may later regret. Another possibility is that a family participating in the training may interpret the parent peer support provider's comments as critical of their way of parenting and may become angry and upset. There really are other risks, probably a host of things you could think of, that you might want to identify as well that would be specific to any of your program or services. It is therefore important to think ahead and have procedures in place to protect clients and staff from these foreseeable risks. Examples of some procedures that could be put in place to address foreseeable risks to participants might be, for example, explaining to participants in advance that they are free to leave at any time if they become upset, and that leaving will not jeopardize their ability to continue participation at a later date or even limit their ability to receive one-on-one support through the organization in the future. You would also want to make sure that someone is available to step outside with a family member who becomes upset and wait with them until they are calm, or call someone to come and get them. You might also provide a list of additional support, advocacy, and community counseling services to share with the family if they experience adverse effects from program activities. Family-run organizations should also be willing to assist them in a referral to other services if that becomes necessary. A family-run organization can also pursue arrangements with community mental health centers and care management entities for additional supports as needed for individuals affected adversely by program activities. You want to discuss confidentiality at the beginning at the beginning of the group, and do not distribute contact information unless participants give written permission. SAMHSA and other funders require family organizations to have these types of procedures in writing and in place to protect families from foreseeable risks when they participate in the family-run organization programs. Note that if you are applying for more than one program, you will need to separately identify risks and protective procedures for each project, as they might be different, varying on what you might be doing. The next area that we need to discuss in your guidelines is the fair selection of participants. Family-run organizations must be careful to ensure that the selection of program participants is fair and equitable to all qualifying individuals. Organizations should specify characteristics of the focus population to be included as participants in their programs, activities, or services. These qualifying characteristics can include geographic area, age, gender, financial need, educational, mental, or emotional needs. These factors can help to determine the potential clients best suited to the specific program activities and services that are provided by your family-run organization. Your organization may also want to describe particular groups within the population of focus that might be especially vulnerable. Provide as much description as possible about the participants to be served, such as biological, adoptive, foster, or kinship caregivers. Families with children involved in any child-serving system, whether it's juvenile justice, special education, substance use disorder treatment, or child welfare. Families may have private insurance or publicly funded medical assistance, also known as Medicaid. Explain any specific outreach to culturally or linguistically diverse populations. Explain why some families might be excluded from the program, such as the child's age or a geographic area that is outside of the program's service area. Explain if there could be any socioeconomic, gender, racial, or ethnic factors that would exclude any family from participating, or other barriers that would prevent someone from participating. Explain how barriers will be overcome, for example, if transportation is a barrier to participation, that the organization may provide financial assistance or a taxi voucher to enable all families to participate. The third area addressed in the SAMHSA guidelines is the absence of coercion. In most instances, families voluntarily participate in programs offered by a family-run organization, but there are some exceptions if a family is involved with child welfare or the child is involved with juvenile justice. It is important to explain in your guidelines whether your program is voluntary or required, and if required, how families are ordered into the program. Family-run organizations often provide incentives or compensation for participation in some programs. This is often in the form of gift cards or sometimes a cash stipend. While we regard these incentives as a way to encourage participation and also a way to compensate families for their time and travel, incentives or compensation can be perceived as putting pressure on a family to participate and thus seen as a type of coercion to participate. Incentives should be the minimum amount necessary. For SAMHSA grants, the value of incentives paid from SAMHSA funds cannot exceed $30. Family-run organizations need to explain why incentives or compensation are needed and how they encourage participation without coercion. Most organizations collect data on program participants. However, a participant's willingness to participate in data collection activities cannot determine their eligibility to participate in other program activities. This really is an important point. In other words, if a client does not want to allow data collection on their family, you cannot exclude them from program activities. Families can't be coerced into allowing data collection so that they can participate in other aspects of program activities. When family-run organizations have strong confidentiality and patient protection guidelines in place, it paves the way for a more smooth collection of appropriate data. Funders typically require the collection of data for several reasons. Number one could be documentation that demonstrates funding is being used for the intended purpose. Another one might be that documentation can show program effectiveness. And also documentation can be used for ongoing continuous quality improvement efforts, where you can make recommendation about program improvements directly from the participants. Your organization must also discuss data collection guidelines in these guidelines in the FOA. Data can be collected in a variety of ways. We've discussed surveys, questionnaires in the poll, and participant sign-in sheets, program evaluations, or focus groups. Quantitative data is any data that is numerical in a numerical form, such as statistics, percentages, or etc. The researcher analyzes the data with the help of statistics. Examples of quantitative data can include the number of participants, percent of survey responses, test scores, or any quantifiable data. There's also what is known as qualitative research, which asks broad questions and collects feedback data or interview responses from participants. Researchers describe this type of data in themes and patterns based on that set of participants. Examples of qualitative data can include participants' word responses to open-ended questions and focus group discussions. Family organizations need both quantitative and qualitative data to help evaluate and validate the work that they do with families. Oftentimes, family-run organizations may just have anecdotal data, which they've heard stories from families or heard someone say. But you need to define a way that you can collect this. That would be qualitative data. How can you collect it and then use it? And also, how can you begin to collect some quantifiable data about what the work that you're doing with families? Family-run organizations are always asked to collect data. In a grant proposal, you will need to be clear about the type of data you are collecting, who is doing the collecting, and how the data will be collected. Will the family be answering a questionnaire, or will a parent support provider interview a family? Are testing results possibly being used, or is information being gathered from school and hospital records? It's important that anyone collecting data is trained on the data collection methods and understands the importance of accurately collecting data. If you are using a data collection tool, you must also provide copies of the tool you will be using or a link to where the tool can be found online. Let's just say your organization is doing a leadership training for families and you want to do a pre and post test. The tool you have decided to use is the Family Empowerment Scale. It is a validated measurement tool, and it will be self-completed by participants during the first and last sessions of the course. It is important to explain whether families will be asked to include their name on the tool when they complete it, or if it will be anonymous and only the aggregate data will be used to measure progress. As family-run organizations, we are always transparent with families. So it is very important to explain to families beforehand what data is being collected, for what purpose, and how it will be used. If data will be used for individual measurement, then it is necessary to have the family complete a consent form that clearly spells out several different things. What data is being collected? Is it aggregate scores or an empowerment scale or individual family intake forms? Why is the data being collected? Will the data be used as a measurement to demonstrate the effectiveness of a program, or is it a requirement of funders or contracts? How information is protected. As families, we know how important it is to trust that our information is protected and remains confidential. When it comes to data collection, it is critical to explain to families whether their names will be included or blacked out on any forms, or if numbers are assigned to each family so they cannot be individually identified. How and where data will be stored is another important issue to families and that needs to be addressed. They need reassurance that their information will be kept securely, either electronically or on paper in locked files behind locked doors. Families also want to know who will have access to the information. Their parent peer support provider or other staff at the family-run organization, or possibly shared with others as a requirement of grants or contracts. Families also need to know when the data will be destroyed and how. There are laws governing how long some records must be retained, and you need to check your state and requirements of funders to answer this question.
Peggy, this is Liz.
Yes,
Can I add
sure.
a piece?
Absolutely.
When we talk about how data is being stored, I want you to think about this, because having been a Statewide Family Network executive director, I know how many times if we have an office, our day doesn't end when we leave the office. We take work home with us. We're working on it after the office is closed. And so when this says how will it be stored, and we say, oh, it's going to be stored in a locked file cabinet in a locked office, you also have to think about, are there times when you are going to be transporting that information to your home or to a meeting somewhere where you are going to discuss the information? And the one piece of let me give you one case, a scenario. You're taking information home to work on it from your office, and out of your peripheral vision, somebody in another car hits you, and the car door swings open, and out goes your briefcase, and out goes all of the paper across the road, and the wind comes up and blows it away. You have no way of knowing who will pick up what piece of paper, will read it, and will have that information then available to them. So when it talks about how and where is it going to be stored, it really is talking more than just a locked file cabinet. If you are going to be taking it somewhere else, or your staff is going to be taking it somewhere else, you need to think about how are you going to protect it during that transition from one location to another. Thanks, Peggy.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Liz. Yeah,
well,
go ahead,
Peggy, if I could chime in as well, and I think laptops are very vulnerable to that kind of thing. That I know when I was running a statewide family organization, there were times when laptops were stolen. We had a break-in in one of our offices, and the computers were all stolen. So you have to make sure they're password protected and all of those types of things as well. So yeah, data, you have to look at that in so many different ways at this point in time. The other issue that I've had come up in some states is requirements by funders to transmit information family by family. And that, I think, is a huge issue for all of us. And, you know, in my view, even whether we can agree to do that or didact families' names and give them numbers, that type of thing. If it's a requirement of the state for funding, and I know it is at places, then families need to be aware of that. We need to inform them this information is being shared as a requirement of our funding. Not easy to do, but we, as Peggy said earlier, we have to be transparent about all this with our families. Okay, thanks, Peggy.
Sure. Thank you. Those are both very important topics. And one other note that I'll make on that Liz brought up about transporting records. When I was with the Statewide Family Network in Wyoming, and our family support partners traveled all over the state into meetings, they each had a locked portable file cabinet with a little tote, but they kept that in their trunk, in the trunk of their car. So the files that they needed to go to a meeting or to meet with a family, they would lock their briefcase in their trunk. They would lock the files in that locked little file cabinet tote. So there are things that you can think about of keeping them safe and keeping the family's information protected. Good thoughts. Moving to the next section that we have to discuss is around privacy and confidentiality. And I know that if you ever go to the doctor, you have to sign those HIPAA forms over and over to the point that I want to just say, you can keep your form, I'll sign it, but I don't need another 100 copies of this form. But you know, privacy and confidentiality really is critical as we work with families. This slide just talks about the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that we know as HIPAA, that was approved in 1996, and it includes provisions for national standards for electronic healthcare transactions and federal privacy protections for individually identifiable health information under what's called the Privacy Rule. These standards are based on the current practice that confidential health information should not be used or disclosed, unless necessary to carry out the function of an entity or organization. In light of these HIPAA regulations and the need to honor and protect the confidentiality of personal information, family-run organizations must develop policies and practices regarding individually identifiable health information. Failure to establish and implement these policies and practices may result in a loss of funding for the family-run organization. More importantly, families may lose their confidence when working with the organization if they experience a failure of the organization to competently handle their family's confidential information. The standards for privacy of individually identifiable health information, or the Privacy Rule, establishes for the first time a set of national standards for the protection of certain health information. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or we know it as HHS, issued the Privacy Rule to implement the requirement of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. The Privacy Rule standards address the use and disclosure of individuals' health information called protected health information by organizations that are subject to the Privacy Rule. And a family-run organization that obtains information from family members is subject to all of the requirements of the Privacy Rule. The Privacy Rule protects all individually identifiable health information held or transmitted by a family-run organization. The Privacy Rule calls this information Protected Health Information, or PHI. Protected health information includes past, present, or future information about the individual's physical or mental health or condition, the provision of health care to the individual, or the payment for the provision of health care to the individual, or any information for which there is a reasonable basis to believe it can be used to identify the individual, such as many common identifiers like the name, the address, birth date, and social security number. The privacy rule also states that this information is protected in any form, whether it is electronic, paper, or oral. This means it must be protected on computers through security passwords, as Jane talked about, or encryption, protected on paper by having locked files behind locked doors, and protected orally by ensuring that staff are mindful about when and where they have conversations and where they use their phones to conduct business. I remember clearly when I was with the Statewide Family Network in Wyoming having a staff lunch one day out of one of our local restaurants, and after we'd placed our order, that big table of about 12 or 13, at one end of the table a discussion started about a specific family they were working with. And as soon as I caught wind of that, I stopped it immediately. We were in a public place where people in the small state of Wyoming, it doesn't take very many identifiable things for someone to know who you're talking about, even down to what their car or truck looks like. And we have to be very careful that we protect that individual health information. The resource section here at the end is going to contain a link where you can download a listing of all the types of protected health information in the law. And I really caution family-run organizations to not just blow this off. This is really important that you're aware of how you're handling a family's confidential information. And with the expansion of technology and electronic health records, breaches of protected health information is on the rise. Family-run organizations are especially vulnerable and should prioritize development of strategies to combat these breaches. The Department of Health and Human Services receives annual reports regarding confidentiality breaches, and the numbers really are staggering. The number listed here is addressing large breaches, and it has affected over 150 million patients. That was in 2009. We must be careful. Ensuring that family-run organization staff members understand the importance of maintaining a family's confidential information is the first critical strategy to stop potential confidentiality violations or accidents. Staff training should be conducted every year with a focus on understanding the proper handling of confidential family members' information. A special section on this topic should be included at every staff in-service training. The trainer should review the organization's policies and procedures on collecting and handling confidential client information, in addition to checking for compliance by each employee. Additionally, all staff members should be required to sign a confidentiality statement at the time of employment. Tiara, would you pull up the sample confidentiality statement that we have available? You'll be able to see it on your screen, and you'll also be able to download this and customize it for your organization. This statement addresses an employee's commitment to maintain confidentiality. The confidentiality statement needs to include a statement that confidentiality extends beyond the period of employment, and that when an employee leaves the organization, they are still bound to maintain confidentiality about any families they have worked with or have knowledge of. A sample document that can be customized is shown here, and you can download it. I always get tickled when I think about staff confidentiality. It's not funny, but that about staff training and how you have to be sure that your staff members are very clear on what confidentiality is and what information they need to keep confidential. At one point in time, unfortunately, we had an employee that felt it was not confidential if she could get to it. And so if she could get into someone else's file drawer and access information that she had no business seeing, to her it was not confidential. Needless to say, she was dismissed and she lost her appeal on trying to get unemployment benefits. Thank you, Tiara. Family-run organizations must often transmit information electronically, and it's necessary to ensure that passwords, virus protection, backup procedures, and encryption programs are all in place to protect personal information. We are beyond the stage of just being one or two families working on the kitchen table that want to help your neighbor come in and see how you can help them. If you're receiving federal funding, you must have well-established procedures in place to protect confidential information. Even if you're not receiving federal funding, you definitely should have these procedures in place. A violation of confidentiality often happens by accident or carelessness. Leaving a file on a desk at the end of the day, or discussing a family member with another staff member over lunch, or sending information through an email without it being encrypted. Oftentimes it's not intended, it just happens. But we have to be careful. Confidentiality extends to all aspects of our work at all hours of the day and by all means of communication. At intake or at the start of a program, families should also be asked to sign a consent to release information. Tiara, if you would pull that form up for us. This is another sample form that you can customize for your organization. By signing a consent to release information, a family is acknowledging their understanding that their rights to privacy and confidentiality will be respected by all employees and will only be released with the family's signature on this release form. It is the responsibility of the family-run organization to ensure that the consent forms are fully explained to the family before they are asked to sign the form. Okay, Tiara, let's go back to the slide, please. A valid consent to release form must include the parent or guardian's name, the purpose of the disclosure, and the purpose could be for school or for other programs. Often a generic term like coordination of care can be used for the purpose of disclosure. The program making the disclosure must be listed. The name of that program has to be included, as well as the recipient of the information, who's going to be getting the information. It's also important to describe the specific information to be released: school records, hospital records, a medication list, a behavior plan, a safety plan. Families may permit some information to be disclosed, but not all information. They could choose to not release any reports they do not feel appropriately reflect their child. It is their right to choose what information your organization can and cannot release or be released to you. The form must also include a statement describing how a family could change their mind to revoke their consent and say, I don't want my information disclosed. Consent to release information expires, and it is important to put an expiration date on the form. The standard is usually for 1 year before the parent must sign another release form. It's important
Peggy,
to note that
yeah. Oh, sorry. This is Jane.
No,
I just wanted to comment on that consent to release information expiring. Any of you on the line who may be currently or in the future billing Medicaid, when Medicaid came in and did our audit, and we were working with some families in wraparound, intensive wraparound long-term, and had certainly gotten that consent form when they entered wraparound, but did not look and have it updated as they were in year 2, and Medicaid cited us for that and said we needed to annually have that consent form. So just be mindful if you are working with a family long term, or you have a family that, you know, went on their way and are now coming back 2 years later or a year later, you need to get a new consent form for that.
Thank you, Jane. You know, it's also important to note that consent to release information is only for the person or agency listed on the release form. It may not be transferred or forwarded to another agency without another release form being signed. For example, if a family agrees to release their child's school records to the family-run organization, and the family-run organization is working with the case manager to get services for the child, the family-run organization may not forward the school records to the case manager. Another consent to release information form would have to be signed by the parent. Tiara, if you'd pull up the sample of consent to obtain information. Often families want the parent peer support provider to review school records or test results. A parent must then sign a consent to obtain information that includes all of the same information as the release form. It identifies who is being asked to release information, such as the school or psychologist, and for what purpose, such as care coordination, and who is the information to be sent to, such as the name of the parent peer support provider and the family-run organization. This form should also be carefully reviewed with the family prior to their signing the form. It's not uncommon for agencies to require families to sign their own forms as well. Okay, Tiara. Okay. So everything we discussed about expiration date and needing to renew it applies to this consent to obtain information as well. The next section that we'll discuss in the guidelines has to do with adequate consent procedures. We've already talked about all of these areas, about whether participation is voluntary, family's right to leave at any time without problems, possible risks from participation in the project, and plans to protect families from risks. The guidelines for this section are really asking how families will consent to their participation, and you will need to address that in this section. It's all right to pull information from the other section of the guidelines that talks about each of these areas around voluntary participation, absence of coercion, the ability to leave, possible risks, and bring that into the format of how families will consent to the participation in light of those things. To ensure that families fully understand what they're signing, family-run organizations should use multiple methods to obtain consent for participation or for release of information. Going back to all the consent forms that we've talked about, it must be written in language that's understandable. It needs to be written in the family's first language. It must be reviewed by a staff member with the family before asking them to sign it. Don't just throw a pile of papers to them and say sign everywhere at the bottom. Invite them to question anything on there that they're uncertain about, and reassure them that there's no coercion involved, and it really is the family's decision, that there will be no negative repercussions to them. If your organization doesn't have the capability of doing forms in a family's first language, often your county or community might have translation services available through the court system. We found the state education department was very helpful in getting forms and documents translated for our family organization at no cost. So several places that you might be able to check for that. And the last area, I know you're all going, yay, the last area that SAMHSA grantees are required to discuss are the risks and benefits to their program or activity. This discussion is more appropriate to research being conducted to test new medications or new types of treatment. But nevertheless, family-run organizations are expected to briefly discuss the risks and benefits of what is being proposed in the grant request. All of the areas discussed previously are intended to minimize risk for families, and these include voluntary participation by families, the right to leave at any time, no negative consequences, and that procedures are in place for unforeseen risks. Again, these were discussed earlier in the guidelines, but you will need to repeat those here and frame that in a discussion about risk and benefit. Family-run organizations believe in the value of family support in all its forms, and articulating the benefits that families would receive from your program are often not difficult to do. When discussing the benefits, be sure to identify the benefits to individual families as well as benefits to the broader system of care. I used to struggle with this section because I thought, oh, I could think of all kinds of benefits of what we were doing, but I had a hard time thinking about the risk, potential risks that might be there. And the external evaluator that we worked with was really good to help me think through that process. Jane also, Jane Walker that's on this call, also had a lot of good information about how to really think about the potential risks. So don't just focus on all the good and the benefit you'll do. You must cover risks as well, but have fun writing this section about the benefits, because I know your family-run organization has a lot to offer. Patient protection and confidentiality really is critical for family-run organizations. And it's our hope that this presentation has assisted in preparing you to better address these important issues. You can't think like I used to. The first couple of times I wrote the Family Support Network grant was that, oh, we don't have to do that section. And then, you know, when we got funding, they said, you do need to do this section. And I was like, well, I don't know what to do, so I'll contact our evaluator. And she was great to help us with that. But you have the tools today to really be able to put this section together for your organization, and then you would have it to draw on when you do whoever you apply to for funding, that you could customize that for specific applications and programs if you need to. Any question and answers, and we'll go over the resource section a little later, but we can deal with, Jane, if there were any questions that came through the chat, or how do you want to address this?
No, but I want to ask a clarifying question to both you and Liz, and that's about the SAMHSA $30. And my question is a clarifying one about whether, for example, if a family came to a focus group and received a $30 stipend, and then you were doing a survey and on perhaps a different topic, but within the same time frame, is the SAMHSA guideline a one-time only maximum $30, or would a family be eligible in different circumstances? Or if you were doing an ongoing training for which you were using the $30 to support their transportation or child care, can you provide some clarification on that? Liz?
Sure. You should be able to provide the stipend for each activity that you're asking that family to do for you. And what I would say is typically SAMHSA's response is, what are your written guidelines within your agency? And then if you have questions about clarifying whether or not this is the same activity or a separate activity, then we suggest that you call us on an individual basis to clarify that, because it may be different in many different circumstances.
Okay. But technically, a family, if you were doing like a 6-week leadership training and had funding to pay $30 each week to cover their child care, transportation, you would be able to pay the $30 each time.
Correct.
Okay. That's what I was hoping you would say. Okay.
And I don't have anything to add. Liz is the boss on that, so.
Yep, we know. All right. Any other questions out there? I know it's been a lot of information, and Peggy, you did a stellar job explaining it all. And Liz, thank you for the additional comments and information. So Peggy, you want to go through the resources there?
Sure. The sample forms that we did talk about in the presentation about the staff confidentiality, client informed consent, consent to release information, and consent to obtain information, they're all available in the box for download right beneath the public chat section. If you do not get them downloaded here, they will be available on FREDLA's website in the resource section, if not today, in the very near future. And on the resource page, there would be a section that says confidentiality and patient protection, and so those forms would be available there. And again, any of those forms, they're just put in a simple format that you can take that and then retype it on however you want to do it, because I believe they are in a PDF format. If you need it in a different format, contact me and we'll help you, but you can put in your logo and any other specific information about your organization. The other resources that we have specifically here, links to the HIPAA privacy rule that you do need to probably have a copy in your organization and be familiar with that. And the second one here, this list of identifiers protected under HIPAA, that's a real good listing from NIH that shows you exactly what they're talking about. And then also the other one is about consumer rights, materials for consumers, about rights under HIPAA. So that's what I have on resources. Jane?
Yeah, and we have requested an office hours. The difference between office hours and what we're doing today is that in an office hour, you can call directly and talk with Peggy and ask questions related to your specific organization. We're not there to write people's section Appendix 4 or to give any advice. We're there to help you think it through for yourself. And we're hoping to schedule that on February 27th at 3 p.m. We're waiting confirmation on that. We'll be sending out details on that if you would be interested in calling in during office hours to get specific information for your organization. A reminder that the PowerPoint and all of the resources can be downloaded. Tiara, can you share in the chat box when the recording of this webinar might be available? The transcript or the recording? Okay, she's going to put that in the chat box. And I wanted to let people know that our next learning community is scheduled for February 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern. The topic is family engagement in juvenile justice. We will be highlighting two family-run organizations, PPAL in Massachusetts and FIC in Arizona, who have been contracting with juvenile justice on support services for families. And we're delighted that we also have someone from the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, otherwise known as OJJDP, who will be talking with us about the department's commitment to family engagement. This promises to be an outstanding learning community. In March, we have another compelling learning community titled On the Front Lines, Family-Run Organizations Responding to the Opioid Epidemic. This is something we see in the news on a daily basis, and it is a tragedy in every sense of the word. And again, we'll be featuring 2 family organizations that have specifically developed programs to respond to this epidemic. We are excited also that in April, we'll be releasing our ethics workbook. This is a workbook developed by 14 family-run organizations across the state, definitely a team effort, on ethics for parent peer support providers. We know that that is one of the core competencies for parent peer support providers, and so we have developed this workbook and are holding our breath for the release, and we'll be hosting a webinar on that in April. So you can see we have a lot of outstanding topics and presenters in the next couple of months. You can always join our Family Leadership Learning Community closed Facebook page at the link you see there, and you can always contact Bredla if you are in need of technical assistance or have thoughts on how we can improve the learning community, or possibly even topics for future learning communities. You see Saria's Ratliff's email there. Saria is also project coordinator with Fredla. I want to thank our presenters, Liz Sweet and Peggy Nickel, and special thanks to our tech team at the University of Maryland. Tiara, we surely could not have done this without you. Thanks so much. I want to remind people, as I did at the beginning, that University of Maryland is doing a survey. So before you close out the page, you see the link right there. Please take a moment and just complete the very brief survey. Lastly, a big thanks to all of you for sharing your part of the day with us. Be warm, everyone, and stay well. So we're